Bones snap and shatter in the deep shadows of Oakhaven Forest, masked by the howling wind. Gwyneth thought she was merely gathering winter herbs, completely unaware that pulling a silver arrow from a dying beast would bind her soul to the most ruthless alpha king in the realm. Frost clung to the brittle leaves of the whispering woods, crunching beneath Gwyneth's worn leather boots. She was too far from the village of Oakhaven, past the safety markers laid down by the local magistrate, but desperation drove her. The apothecary's shelves were bare, and the winter cough had already claimed 3 elders. She needed Sweet Annie, white willow bark, and the rare frost-touched yarrow that only grew near the jagged ravines of Harper's Creek. Gwyneth knelt by the icy water, her numb fingers carefully snipping the pale yellow flowers, when a low, wet, rattling sound froze the blood in her veins. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound of something drowning in its own lungs. Cautiously, she drew her iron foraging knife and crept toward the thicket of hawthorn bushes. What she saw there made her drop her woven basket. Lying in a bed of crushed ferns and crimson-stained snow was a wolf, but calling it a wolf felt like calling a mountain a mere stone. The creature was gargantuan, its coat a midnight tapestry of charcoal and obsidian, thick with muscle and scars. Yet, for all its terrifying size, the beast was utterly helpless. A massive, iron-shafted arrow was buried deep into its massive rib cage, perilously close to the lung. The wound didn't just bleed, it festered with a thick, blackened ooze that smelled sharply of ozone and burnt copper. Silver. Every child in the kingdom of Ethelgard knew the laws. The beasts of the north were monsters. To harbor one, to help one, was high treason, punishable by the hangman's noose. Gwyneth took a step back, her survival instincts screaming at her to run back to the village, to alert Captain Harrison and his guards. The wolf's golden eyes flickered open. They were not the mindless, feral eyes of an animal. They held a startling, piercing intelligence, swimming with an agonizing haze of pain. The creature let out a pathetic, shuddering breath, its massive head falling back into the snow in defeat. Gwyneth cursed her soft heart. She was a healer. To walk away from a dying creature, even a monster, went against the very core of her being. "If you bite me, I will leave you to bleed out," Gwyneth whispered, her voice trembling as she dropped to her knees beside the colossal predator. The wolf merely watched her, its chest heaving. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced, frantic precision. She tore the linen of her apron into thick strips. The arrow was barbed. Pulling it straight out would tear the artery. She had to push it through. "This is going to hurt," she breathed, placing her hands on the thick, metallic shaft. "Do not move." With a swift, brutal shove, she drove the arrow through the beast's flank. The wolf erupted into a deafening, agonizing roar, its massive jaws snapping the trunk of a nearby sapling in half. Gwyneth flinched, but didn't retreat, grabbing the bloody arrowhead and snapping it off with a stone before pulling the smooth shaft back out. Blackened blood rushed from the wound. Gwyneth immediately packed it with a mixture of dried sphagnum moss and pulverized yarrow, pressing down with all her weight to stop the hemorrhaging. The silver had poisoned the tissue. She could see the dark veins spreading across the wolf's skin. She chewed on the Sweet Annie leaves to release their enzymes, mixing it with water from her flask, and carefully dripped the bitter liquid into the wolf's mouth to combat the infection. For 3 days and 3 nights, Gwyneth did not return to the village. She dragged the heavy, unconscious beast into an abandoned trapper's dugout hidden beneath the roots of an ancient oak. She built a small, smokeless fire, cleaned the wound with boiled water and comfrey root, and kept the creature warm with her own heavy wool cloak. On the morning of the 4th day, Gwyneth awoke to the sound of crunching snow. She bolted upright, her hand flying to her knife, but the dugout was empty. Her cloak lay neatly folded on a flat stone. The beast was gone. Heart pounding, she crawled out of the dugout. Massive paw prints led away toward the northern ridge, disappearing into the dense tree line. Where the wolf had rested, sitting atop her folded cloak, was a single object, a heavy, perfectly polished piece of jet-black obsidian, carved with ancient, jagged runes. Gwyneth hid the stone deep in her pocket, gathered her herbs, and hurried back to Oakhaven. When she arrived, the village was in chaos. Captain Harrison and a dozen heavily armed king's guards were tearing through the marketplace. "Where have you been, girl?" Harrison barked. his hand resting on the pommel of his sword as Gwyneth approached the square. "Gathering willow bark near the creek, Captain," she lied smoothly, keeping her head bowed. "The winter fever is spreading." "Have you seen anything? Large tracks? Disturbed earth?" Harrison pressed, leaning in close. He smelled of cheap ale and unwashed leather. "A hunting party from the capital ambushed the Lichen King in the northern pass. They put a silver-tipped ballista bolt in him, but the beast crawled away. He's dying in these woods somewhere." Gwyneth's blood ran cold. The creature she had spent 3 days nursing back to health in a dirty dugout wasn't just a werewolf. It was the Alpha King of the North. "I saw nothing, Captain," Gwyneth said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror gripping her chest. "Only deer tracks." Harrison grunted, waving her away. Gwyneth rushed back to her small cottage, locking the heavy wooden door behind her. She pulled the carved obsidian stone from her pocket, her fingers tracing the rough edges. She had saved the most dangerous creature in the kingdom. If anyone ever found out, she was a dead woman. She prayed to the Creator that the beast would return to his frozen mountains and forget she ever existed. But a wolf never forgets a scent, and an Alpha King never leaves a debt unpaid. A month passed. The bitter chill of winter began to thaw into a muddy, miserable spring. Gwyneth had almost convinced herself that the encounter in the woods was a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by the biting cold. She kept the obsidian stone buried at the bottom of her flour barrel, out of sight, and then came the day of the spring harvest festival. The village square of Oakhaven was draped in faded bunting, the scent of roasted mutton and spiced wine filling the air. Gwyneth was busy wrapping a poultice for old Mrs. Higgins when the ground began to tremble. It wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was a rhythmic, terrifying vibration, accompanied by the low, resonant thrum of heavy war drums echoing from the surrounding hills. The music in the square died instantly. The laughter turned into choked gasps of horror. Gwyneth stepped out of her cottage just in time to see the tree line explode with movement. Dozens, no, hundreds of massive wolves poured from the whispering woods, forming an impenetrable, snarling ring around the entire village. They were the Ironwood Pack, the most feared military force in the Northern Territories. Behind them rode men and women on horseback, clad in dark furs and boiled leather, armed with brutal iron weaponry. The villagers screamed, scattering like frightened sheep, but the wolves snapped their jaws, herding the humans into the center of the muddy square. Captain Harrison drew his sword, his face pale as milk, his guards shaking uncontrollably behind their wooden shields. Then, the ranks of wolves parted. A single rider moved forward on a massive black warhorse. The man was a towering figure, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He wore no armor, only a dark tunic that stretched over a scarred, heavily muscled chest, and a cloak of black fur that draped over his horse's flanks. His hair was dark and unruly, but it was his eyes that made Gwyneth stop breathing. They were the exact golden, predatory eyes of the beast she had saved. Alfred, the Alpha King of the Ironwood Pack, had come to Oakhaven. He dismounted with a terrifying, fluid grace. Every step he took toward the center of the village was measured, radiating an overwhelming, oppressive power that made the air itself feel heavy. "Who is the magistrate of this settlement?" Alfred's voice was a low rumble, deeper than thunder, scraping against the ears of everyone present. Mayor Thomas, a portly man sweating profusely, was shoved forward by his own terrified wife. I am, my lord. What do you want with us? We have paid our taxes to the crown. We have no quarrel with the North." Alfred didn't even look at the mayor. He simply raised a hand. His beta, a lean, scarred man named Gideon, stepped forward. Gideon tossed a heavy burlap sack into the mud at the mayor's feet. It hit the ground with a metallic clatter. 4 weeks ago I was hunted, Alfred stated, pacing slowly around the trembling villagers. My convoy was ambushed. The assassins used silver weaponry, specialized weaponry. Gideon kicked the sack open. Out spilled a dozen massive, heavy, iron-shafted arrows, the exact same kind Gwyneth had pulled from the wolf's chest. Our trackers recovered these from the dead assassins, Gideon sneered, his eyes scanning the crowd. The ironwork is distinct. It bears the maker's mark of a blacksmith in this very village. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Arthur, the village blacksmith, who fell to his knees, weeping instantly. "I swear it! I was commissioned by a hooded man. They paid me in pure gold. I didn't know what they were for." Alfred stopped pacing. "I do not care about a foolish blacksmith making tools for coin." His golden eyes narrowed, lifting to scan the terrified faces of the villagers. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding as he tasted the air. "I care about the traitor who tipped them off to my location, and I care about the scent that has haunted my waking hours since I bled into your soil." Gwyneth's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to step backward, to melt into the shadows of the apothecary awning, but the crowd was too tight. Alfred's gaze snapped directly to her. The world seemed to stop. For a terrifying second, there was no village, no pack, no terrified guards. There was only the predator and the prey. He moved toward her, ignoring the guards who scrambled out of his way. Captain Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but Gideon's hand clamped onto the hilt of his sword, silencing the human captain instantly. Alfred stopped inches from Gwyneth. Up close, he was even more intimidating. She could see a faint silver-white scar peeking out from the collar of his tunic, right where she had packed the wound with moss and yarrow. He leaned down, his face hovering just above her neck. He inhaled slowly, a deep, resonant sound. "Dried pine," Alfred murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper meant only for her ears. "And sweet Annie." Gwyneth stood her ground, refusing to tremble, though her knees felt like water. "I don't know what you're talking about, my lord." Alfred's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smirk. "You are a terrible liar, little healer." He straightened up, turning to face the village. "The blacksmith's life is spared, for now. But this village is under Ironwood jurisdiction until the traitor is found." "You can't do this," Mayor Thomas squeaked. "We are subjects of King." "I just did," Alfred roared, his voice echoing off the valley walls, making several villagers collapse in fear. He turned his golden eyes back to Gwyneth. "And as collateral for your village's cooperation, I am taking her." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Gwyneth's eyes went wide. "What? No, you can't just take me." "Can I not?" Alfred reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapping gently but immovably around her wrist. It wasn't a harsh grip, but the sheer strength behind it was undeniable. "My lord, please," Gwyneth pleaded, dropping her voice. "I saved you. I kept your secret. Is this how you repay a debt?" Alfred leaned in close, his golden eyes flashing with a mix of fury and something much darker, something possessive. "You pulled a silver arrow forged in this village from my chest. You are the only one who knew I survived. Until I know whether you are my savior or a spy who played her part to finish the job, you belong to me." Before Gwyneth could struggle, Alfred swept her off her feet, easily lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing but air. He carried her to his massive black horse, setting her sideways in the saddle before vaulting up behind her. He trapped her between his unyielding chest and the horse's neck, grabbing the reins. "Burn the forge," Alfred commanded Gideon. "And if any human tries to leave Oakhaven before I find the truth, kill them." With a sharp whistle, the Ironwood pack turned, retreating back into the dense, dark woods of the north. Gwyneth looked back at her home, watching the smoke rise from Arthur's forge, realizing with a sickening drop in her stomach that she was now the prisoner of the very beast she had risked everything to save. And as they rode deep into the freezing, treacherous mountains toward Dunwall Keep, Alfred's arm remained tightly wrapped around her waist, his scent of pine and raw power enveloping her completely. She was a captive, yes, but the way his chest rumbled against her back and the fierce, protective growls he directed at any pack member who rode too close suggested a terrifying twist she had yet to understand. He hadn't just taken a hostage. He had claimed a mate. Within the towering granite walls of Dunwall Keep, shadows stretched long and cold across the stone floors. Gwyneth was not thrown into a damp dungeon, as she had feared during the terrifying ride up the mountain. Instead, King Alfred confined her to his own private quarters, a sprawling suite adorned with thick bearskin rugs, tapestries of ancient battles, and a massive hearth that burned day and night. Guarded heavily by Gideon and a hand-picked selection of elite warriors, she was a prisoner draped in velvet and fed on roasted pheasant. Days bled into weeks, and Gwyneth learned the dangerous rhythm of the pack. Alfred visited her chambers only when the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the northern territories. He would sit by the fire, shedding his heavy furs, his massive frame exhausted from the endless demands of his kingdom. He rarely spoke of the ongoing investigation in Oakhaven, choosing instead to watch her with those penetrating golden eyes, asking quiet questions about herbs, healing, and her life before the wolves descended on her village. Gwyneth soon realized the fearsome Alpha King was hiding a deadly secret. During one of his evening visits, Alfred collapsed heavily into a leather armchair, a sharp, ragged breath tearing from his throat. Gwyneth noticed the faint tremor in his hands and the unnatural pallor beneath his sun-baked skin. The silver poisoning was not gone. Her crude woodland surgery had saved him from immediate death, but the metallic toxins were still slowly weaving their way through his bloodstream, weakening him day by day. "You are dying," Gwyneth stated plainly, stepping away from the hearth to stand before him. Alfred looked up, a dangerous rumble vibrating in his chest. "Watch your tongue, little healer. Showing weakness in this fortress is an invitation for a blade in the dark." "I am not one of your ambitious generals," Gwyneth shot back, her fear of the beast entirely eclipsed by her healer's instincts. "Take off your tunic." He hesitated, his jaw tightening, before pulling the dark fabric over his head. The sight made Gwyneth gasp softly. The ragged scar on his ribcage, where she had pulled the iron-shafted arrow, was surrounded by a spiderweb of blackened veins. The infection was creeping dangerously close to his heart. "If your enemies discover this, your reign is over," she murmured, her fingertips lightly brushing the hot, inflamed skin. Alfred shivered at her touch, his golden eyes darkening with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My enemies are closer than you think, Gwyneth. The inner circle is fracturing." Lord Reginald of House Astor, a wealthy and historically private family that controls the eastern trade routes, has been demanding my presence at the border. He claims rogue packs are testing our defenses, but I know it is a trap. If I ride out in this state, I will not return. "Then we must cure you," Gwyneth determined, turning toward the heavy wooden door. "I need my apothecary bag. I need wintergreen, activated charcoal, and the root of the white monkshood." "Monkshood is lethal to my kind," Alfred warned, grabbing her wrist gently but firmly. "Only if brewed incorrectly," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Trust me. You trusted me in the snow, Alfred. Trust me now." Hearing his name on her lips seemed to break something inside the towering king. He released her wrist, nodding slowly. For the next 3 days, Gwyneth transformed the royal chambers into a bustling apothecary. She worked tirelessly, grinding herbs and boiling bitter concoctions over the roaring fire. Alfred drank every foul-tasting vial she offered without complaint. Slowly, the black veins began to recede. His strength returned, his golden eyes burning brighter, his aura of oppressive, terrifying power filling the room once more. However, Gwyneth's constant presence in the king's chambers had not gone unnoticed by the court. Lady Beatrice, a high-ranking female of House Astor and Lord Reginald's fiercely ambitious daughter, had long considered herself the rightful Luna of the Ironwood pack. She possessed stunning, icy beauty, with hair the color of spun moonlight and a vicious temperament to match. Beatrice despised the human healer who had somehow ensnared the Alpha's attention. During the grand feast of the winter solstice, the tension finally snapped. Torches blazed brightly in the great hall as hundreds of pack members tore into roasted meats and drank heavily from silver goblets. Gwyneth was seated at the high table, placed shockingly close to Alfred's right hand. The king looked magnificent, his health fully restored, radiating a lethal dominance that kept the room in eager submission. Beatrice approached the high table, holding a beautifully crafted goblet of spiced wine. Her smile was like a drawn dagger. "My king," Beatrice purred, bowing low enough to display her assets, "we rejoice in your robust health. Allow me to offer a toast to our continued prosperity and to the human guest who has entertained you during your recovery." She extended the goblet toward Gwyneth. Alfred's eyes narrowed, a low growl starting deep in his throat, but Gwyneth reached out, taking the golden cup. As her fingers brushed the metal, the pungent, masking scent of cinnamon and clove hit her nose, but beneath it lay something far more sinister. It smelled like crushed almonds and burnt copper, foxglove mixed with crushed silver dust, a lethal dose for a human, and highly debilitating to a wolf. Gwyneth did not drink. She calmly placed the goblet on the heavy oak table. A generous offer, Lady Beatrice, but as a healer, I avoid spirits during the solstice. My mind must remain sharp. Beatrice's smile tightened into a snarl. Do you insult my hospitality, human? I merely protect my health, Gwyneth replied smoothly. She picked up a silver spoon and dipped it into the wine. The metal immediately tarnished, turning a sickly shade of black. Gasps erupted around the high table. Gideon drew his dagger instantly. Alfred stood, kicking his heavy wooden chair back, with a force that splintered it against the stone floor. The hall fell deathly quiet. His golden eyes were locked onto Beatrice, blazing with uncontrolled, murderous fury. Treason! Alfred roared, the sound shaking the very foundations of the keep.
My lord, she lies, Beatrice shrieked, backing away as Alfred stepped over the table.
The human poisoned it to frame me. She is the spy from Oakhaven. The human just saved my life while you attempted to end hers, Alfred snarled, grabbing Beatrice by the throat and lifting her effortlessly off the floor. He looked toward the Astor family guards, who remained frozen in terror. Throw her in the holding cells. When dawn breaks, I will deal with Lord Reginald and his treacherous house. Alfred dropped the gasping woman, turning back to Gwyneth. He took her trembling hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so tender it shocked the watching pack. No one touches what is mine, he declared loud enough for every wolf in the fortress to hear. Midnight struck the Iron Bell Tower, echoing through the desolate courtyards of Dunwall Keep. Gwyneth could not sleep. The confrontation in the Great Hall had ignited a powder keg. Lord Reginald of House Astor, realizing his daughter's failure and his impending execution, had not waited for dawn. He had rallied his loyalists, plunging the fortress into a brutal, bloody civil war in the dead of night. Clashing steel and feral roars echoed through the stone corridors. Gideon had locked Gwyneth inside the royal chambers, stationing 5 massive warriors at her door. But Gwyneth knew the layout of the castle now. She knew about the servants' passage hidden behind the tapestry of the first hunt. If Lord Reginald had planned a coup, he would not rely solely on his own men. He would use the same weapon that had nearly killed Alfred in the woods. He would use the poisoned arrows. Gwyneth grabbed her foraging knife and slipped through the hidden doorway, descending the narrow, spiraling staircase into the bowels of the fortress. She had to reach the armory before Astor's men could distribute the silver weapons. Cold drafts whipped through the subterranean tunnels. Gwyneth moved silently, her soft boots making no sound on the damp stone. As she neared the heavy iron doors of the lower armory, she heard hushed, panicked voices.
Load the ballistas. If the king shifts, normal steel won't pierce his hide, a gruff voice commanded.
Gwyneth peered around the corner. 4 men, wearing the crest of House Astor, were frantically prying open long wooden crates. Inside lay dozens of massive, black-shafted arrows. The very same design forged by Arthur back in Oakhaven. The missing puzzle piece clicked into place. Lord Reginald was the hooded man who had commissioned the blacksmith. He had orchestrated the ambush in the Whispering Woods, framing the human village to force Alfred into a reckless war, aiming to usurp the throne while the king was distracted. Gwyneth didn't think. She acted. She spotted a lantern resting on a nearby barrel of black powder used for blasting mining tunnels. She sprinted out from the shadows, grabbing the heavy iron lantern. "Hey, the human!" one of the guards shouted, drawing a rusted broadsword. Gwyneth hurled the lantern directly at the powder barrel. The glass shattered, spilling burning oil over the volatile dust. "Run!" another man screamed. Gwyneth threw herself backward into the corridor just as a deafening explosion ripped through the armory. A shockwave of heat and splintering wood slammed into her, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending her crashing to the stone floor. Thick, choking smoke filled the air, accompanied by the groans of the Astor guards who had been caught in the blast. Coughing violently, Gwyneth tried to stand, but a heavy, soot-stained hand grabbed her ankle. The guard captain, half his face burned, dragged her toward him, raising a jagged dagger. "You ruined everything, you wretched little." Before the blade could fall, a terrifying shadow eclipsed the smoke. Alfred tore through the burning doorway like a god of war. He was fully shifted, a monstrous, towering, dire wolf of midnight black, his golden eyes burning through the haze. With a single, savage swipe of his massive claws, he threw the guard captain across the stone corridor, neutralizing the threat instantly. The enormous wolf turned to Gwyneth, its chest heaving. It gently nudged her shoulder with its wet nose, checking for injuries, before letting out a low, rumbling whine. "I am all right," Gwyneth choked out, reaching up to bury her hands in his thick, dark fur. "The silver. I destroyed the silver." Alfred shifted back into his human form seamlessly, ignoring his lack of clothing as he scooped her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," Alfred breathed, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent of dried pine and sweet Annie. "You nearly died. Again." "I was protecting my king," Gwyneth whispered, her arms wrapping tightly around his broad shoulders. Alfred pulled back, his golden eyes piercing her very soul. "I do not want you as my protector, Gwyneth. I do not want you as my prisoner or my guest." He carried her up the stairs, straight into the main courtyard where the battle had finally ceased. The Loyalists had crushed the rebellion. Lord Reginald was on his knees in the mud, surrounded by Gideon and the king's guard. Alfred walked into the center of the carnage, holding Gwyneth for all to see. "House Astor is stripped of its titles and banished to the dead wastes," Alfred commanded, his voice ringing out in the frigid night air. He looked down at the woman in his arms, his expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable and fiercely devoted. "And let it be known," Alfred continued, turning so the entire surviving pack could witness his decree. "Gwyneth of Oakhaven is no longer a human of the southern valleys. She is the savior of the Alpha, the destroyer of treason, and my fated mate." Before Gwyneth could process the weight of his words, Alfred lowered his head and claimed her lips. The kiss was not rough, but it possessed an overwhelming, undeniable permanence. It was a promise of protection, of absolute power, and of a love forged in blood and survival. A roaring cheer erupted from the Ironwood pack, wolves howling their submission and acceptance of their new queen to the starry night sky. Gwyneth leaned into the Alpha King, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She had walked into the woods seeking herbs to save her village. She had walked out holding the heart of the most powerful beast in the realm. Did this thrilling tale of loyalty, betrayal, and fated romance capture your heart? The world of the Ironwood pack is full of dark secrets and passionate twists waiting to be uncovered. If you loved Gwyneth and Alfred's incredible journey, smash that like button, share this epic story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking fantasy werewolf dramas every single week.